Race. And today's topic here is a critically white project possible? I think that is the dilemma that we're in. So really, is there a brownness? I'm asking that question because actually, in the light of the situation in America, where you had the Black Lives Matter, there's been a whole debate actually, because there are those who are of Spanish descent, classified in this other way and that, and there's been a big debate about who's black and not. And this is talking about America, leaving aside, Westbury or, or Mitchell's Plain or something else. So it's an interesting kind of development happening around it. But I thought that after Christie's discussion yesterday and how we come into being as human beings in particular ways with particular thoughts, fears, otherwise, I thought I would share with you something here. So there's a handout, as I'm an old teacher, so there's a little handout here that you take and you can pass on. It's called Races and Racialized Groups. And Larry Bloom is quite an interesting person. He's from the USA, and so he constructs this issue of how we've been racialized, all of us. You can't say we've not been touched in any way. And he looks at different societies in Brazil, in Cuba, and here. So there's some interesting reading and some work that you can do around it in terms of spaces that may have similarities to what we do. But I think without any further ado, I'll pass over to Marissa. This is a joint project here with CriSHET and CanRad. And Marissa is a postdoc. And maybe Marissa, you could say something about what you do, just in terms of your topic area, so that people also understand that, and then you can introduce this to the house.
Okay, well, hi everyone.
Hello.
Okay, hi, so I'm Marissa from CriSHET, and my research focused on memory and trauma studies, specifically politically inflicted trauma. So I worked with figures like Mandela, Ruth First, and those. And today we're actually here for Christi, so I'm not going to continue with my project. Christi is an author, an academic, a columnist, and a former journalist. Her publications include Sitting Pretty, White Afrikaans Women, Postapartheid South Africa, which is on sale here at discounted price, as well as White Power, the Rise and Fall of the National Party. Christi is currently Associate Professor in Sociology at the University of Pretoria, where she has served the university's transformation processes on curriculum and anti-discriminatory policies, and is co-chairperson of the Humanities Transformation Committee. She developed Doing Difference Differently, a critical diversity module for students across all faculties. It's a very interesting project. On a global scale, her global initiatives include serving on a high-level fact-finding mission to Palestine, and as a gender specialist at the UN Economic Commission for Africa. Previous affiliations include the Institute for Reconciliation and Justice at the University of the Free State, as well as the Institute for Humanities in Africa at UCT. And of course, next year, Christi will be joining CanRad here in Port Elizabeth. So give us all a hand for Christi. Welcome her.
Thank you so much. Can I have my musical moment? Okay, great. I don't even know what to call it. Thank you so much Marissa and Alan for the introductions, and thank you for being here this afternoon. I've been excited about coming to CANRAD and to CriSHET at this time. Yesterday I launched my book here at the Nelson Mandela University, courtesy of these two institutions, and today we're going to, in a sense, take the conversation from yesterday forward to look at this question of a critical white project and whether such a thing is actually possible. So, or critically white project rather. So, just to jump in straight, I mean, to the question, is a critically white project possible? I think the short answer is it better be, otherwise we are all in trouble. And the longer answer, for which I assume you've set aside your Friday afternoon, for which I'm very grateful, would go as follows, something along the following lines. So, race and racism, as we know, have proven grimly adaptable and seem to be forging ahead in new and old manifestations in the 21st century. We have seen a shift from biological justifications for racism to cultural rationalizations. This happens against the background and is actually entangled with what the British Jamaican theorist Stuart Hall called the cultural turn. This is not coincidental. It is useful to read this shift as part of the cultural turn of the past 30-odd years, in which contestation has expanded beyond the more formal terrains of politics and economics. The cultural has become inextricably entangled with the political and economic realms, and therefore with political and economic contestations. And I think Trumpism is one example of this, and definitely not the only one. Thus, whiteness as a political and structural position is again reasserting itself, and if we look at whiteness and how it's developed over decades, it is like race, of which it is a subdivision, one could say. It is remarkably resilient because it adapts itself continuously. So that's one of the characteristics of whiteness. So we see how it's again adapting itself in the face of the anti-racist, anti-apartheid, anti-colonial and anti-slavery struggles of the past couple of centuries. So let me just first define how whiteness is understood today. Ruth Frankenberg captured it well in her 1993 book, where she said that whiteness is a location of structural advantage, of race privilege. Second, it is a standpoint, a place from which white people look at themselves, at others, and at society. And third, that whiteness refers to a set of cultural practices that are usually unmarked and unnamed. I would say that this third position has obviously become quite disturbed. The unmarkedness, the unnamedness of whiteness has become quite disturbed because of the activisms of the past 25 years or so since she actually wrote this particular book. And particularly in the South African context, the argument has been made that whiteness is actually very visible. It's actually a very visible power construction. But we can talk about that a bit further later. So several strategies are deployed to rehabilitate and restore white power, particularly at the intersection with patriarchal power. And at this point I do want to foreground that these forms of domination cannot be made sense of in isolation from one another. There are many resonances and destructive affinities among differences in how they are used and abused to create social structures of inequality and injustice. In our context, we must bring colonialism and apartheid's other others into the frames of analysis. Blackness shares many points of connection with other positions of subjugated difference. For example, what Mbembe so powerfully describes in his latest book, he talks about the unrepresentability of the black slave. Now that resonates directly with the unrepresentability of women and of lesbian that, for example, French feminists such as Luce Irigaray and Monique Wittig have written about. The Argentinian decolonial feminist Mario Lugones, I think, is one of those thinkers who can really help us to bring into view the heterosexualism that, together with racism, constituted colonialism. She speaks of the modern colonial gender system in which gender cuts across and racial power relations are organized through gender and sexuality. I would argue with Lugones that the mechanisms of heterosexuality, capitalism, and racial classification are impossible to understand apart from one another. Such theories can help us, for example, when we talk about colonial violence and notions of racial purity, to recognize whose bodies such ideas were most enacted upon, and to undisappear and unobjectify those subjects. It also helps to study how whiteness reinforces other statuses of privilege, for example, masculinity, heteronormativity, and middle-classness. Hegemonic masculinity would be white, heterosexual, and middle class, in relation to which racialized, gendered, sexualized, and classed others are produced. The exclusion of black women take a particular gender, sexual, and racial form, which co-constitutes white middle-class femininity as the hegemonic, most revered form of femininity. Lesbians, gay men, trans people, and other gender non-conforming people are suppressed to the point of erasure within these schemas. And such multifaceted analysis, therefore, can help us to understand the cross-race and cross-gender complicities that sustain the inequalities that colonialism and apartheid have left us with in the South African context. Looking at South Africa and in relation to the research that's presented in my latest book, I found in my own work how routine misrepresentations, willful blindness, and denials of fact are used to rejuvenate racism in our contemporary context. For example, through fancy discursive footwork, and I spoke about this briefly yesterday, we see how certain moral reversals are done between apartheid and democracy. The process of democratization in its multiplicity and uncertainty becomes chaos, which is then contrasted with apartheid as order. Apartheid, in this vein of wishful thinking, one could say, becomes just, therefore. It becomes a fair and just system, and resistance to apartheid during the anti-apartheid struggle becomes the opposite of that. Just to look at what's going on at the moment in South Africa's in this very moment in South Africa, we do see that we've reached incredible levels of polarization, and to my mind, a form of white Schadenfreude has emerged amid multiple political, economic, and constitutional crises 24 years into democracy. Schadenfreude is just a German word that means sort of some kind of satisfaction at damage, sort of enjoying damage that's been caused. While the legacies of apartheid inequity have proven difficult to dismantle, state capture in the form of massive corruption and factional infighting in the ANC has caused governance to take a back seat and has harmed state capacity significantly. At the same time, we also know that we've got a private sector that has been caught out, I don't know how many times over the past number of years, from a bread cartel to a construction cartel, etc., etc. So we've actually got a multi-sectoral public and private problem with corruption in this country. And that's got a number of effects, particularly socioeconomic effects. So, but for white people, well, for some white people at least, they look at the failings of government, they look at the problems that state capacity has run into, and then for them it confirms a racist bias that so-called black people can't govern. So you see a rise in public expressions and incidents of racism, which, as I also said yesterday, seems to suggest a return to an intransigent whiteness that's unapologetic about colonial and apartheid abuses and continuing white privilege. So, looking just at some of the current sort of ideological forms that have sort of boosted race and have boosted whiteness. For me, you know, coming to the fore are the interrelated phenomena of neoliberalism and alt-rightism. So alt-rightism, of course, its poster boy is Donald Trump. It's a discourse that's peppered with prejudice and convoluted lies, half-truths, distortions, delivered with insults and threats of violence. If you want to look for a South African version of that, the organisation AfriForum, if you look at the Deputy CEO, Ernst Roots, and the kinds of public positions that he adopts, and also his mode of actually delivering those positions, I would say that that's our local version of exactly that. We see this alt-right technique of what one could say is like a paradoxical politics of using leftist rhetoric and symbols to advance white male supremacism. For example, when Roots quoted a Jewish Holocaust survivor to threaten a law professor at the Northwest University that she should be hanged high. So, but you're quoting a Jewish Holocaust survivor who was actually talking about Nazi professors at the time, and he's using it now because this law professor, Armin du Plessis, actually dared to criticize AfriForum's statistics that they use in their argument against land redistribution. So you can see how this alt-right kind of convolutions actually work. So for me, AfriForum, looking at their politics, they've become the face of white denial about the past and white defiance of the need for redress in what is the most unequal country in the world, in terms of countries for which states exist. So it's actually translating quite successfully a growing resentment about the loss of Afrikaner control of the state into a political project. And its politics I call a kind of a renovation or a reupholstering, one could say, of Afrikaner nationalism, which I call neo-Afrikaner enclave nationalism. And this is basically a post-apartheid phenomenon that uses what I call inward migration to white spaces where white people can actually quite successfully withdraw from shared spaces, shared interactions, and so on with other people in the space, and into their suburbs, their institutions, their media, and so forth. And then, but they retain this connected. So while they're migrating inwardly, they still retain their connectedness to global whiteness, and that's why AfriForum, for example, is able to steal and borrow and crib all those alt-right messages from the States. And in these discourses, racism becomes recast as culture and heteropatriarchy as family values. And a very important part of how alt-rightism works as a political project is something that it shares with neoliberalism, and that is depoliticization. So both of these, neoliberalism and alt-rightism, they're both examples of what I call a politics of anti-politics. And, for example, using again AfriForum, their campaign at the University of Pretoria, for example, they campaign in the SRC elections with posters where they say what they are for, they're for Afrikaans, that kind of thing. That's now the cultural sort of element. But then they also add there that they are against politics. So they are purporting to not actually be engaging in politics. But at the same time, in this past year or so, they've launched a private student residence that uses the iconography of Jan van Riebeeck and the name Goede Hoop in an apartheid-style nostalgic flashback to that notorious Dutch trading post that started colonialism in this neck of the woods. So you can see again that sort of cultural translation of this sort of white exclusivism. No, it's about we just want to speak Afrikaans and we want to. We think Jan van Riebeeck is funky, and we like the word, the name Goede Hoop, and whatever. So it's all just about my culture, really. I mean, what's your problem? So, And of course we see therefore then a kind of a channeling of this politics through the consumption of products, in this case now of private university accommodation, because it's actually a product that Reform is actually selling to people who want to be with their own kind. So, and this we see then also through media products and so forth. And these are the kinds of processes that constitute this neo-Afrikaner enclave nationalism. So, in terms of this mode of depoliticization, as I've mentioned to you, there's a recasting then of oppressive politics as culture, and then very particular heteropatriarchal and heteropatriarchal norms are perpetuated that prop up particular forms of ethnic whiteness. So-called traditions that are sort of part of my culture are touted as innocuous, apolitical and timeless, and therefore also privileged and not available to transformation, as though they were delivered from some past that is pure and untouched by relations of domination and exclusion. If we dig a bit further into neoliberalism specifically, I'm approaching it here as not only operating in the realm of the economy, but actually being an all-encompassing rationality, the way that Wendy Brown and others have made sense of it. It entrenches hierarchy, authoritarianism and dehumanization, but using the signs of the market and choice. So if one wants to get a sense of neoliberalism, I decided to give a bit of a pop culture-ish kind of example. The term libtard, which is another term that the white right of South Africa have adopted from the US white right. It's a combination of liberal and retard, basically. So the online urban dictionary that you can find if you Google, you see the definitions. The definitions at the top are basically those that receive the most likes from viewers. And it was interesting to see, so the most liked definition of libtard, it's obviously now from people who use the term libtard as a slur. And the definition is, it's an individual whose thinking process has been rendered impaired by political correctness and the failure to understand that people are responsible for their actions and the world does not owe lazy or stupid people a living. Okay, so you see that kind of, that prejudice, that classism, that suggestion of some people are inherently deserving and some people are inherently undeserving. So, and of course this idea of responsible, you have to be responsible for your actions. That is a central plank of neoliberal rationality. So the self-responsibilization is very important in terms of the constitution of the neoliberal subject. You get this hierarchy of the deserving and the undeserving, and of course this hierarchy is then presented as it's naturally occurring and it's an unchangeable phenomenon. So inequality is a natural thing, it's determined by nature actually. It's something that we see in nature. Us human beings also have it. Some human beings are just more advanced and just more deserving. But inherently, because of their inherent characteristics. So you can see it's a twist on the racism. You know, the idea of scientific racism, for example, from the 19th century, just another twist on that. Shauna Hunter talks about neoliberalism's most successful ruse, and which has made it so seductive to rightists and leftists alike. So in that sense, we are in a weird kind of ideological moment, because rightists and leftists are both embracing neoliberalism. And she says this successful ruse is its ability to represent economic norms as non-normative matters of neutral technical expertise. It is through this ruse that neoliberalism gets associated with the realm of practical politics. I'm just being practical, you know, let's be practical. Technical necessity becomes allied with the general social good, and ideological and cultural choice becomes associated with private, particularized desires and individual benefit. Yet this pretense to the prioritization of the general universal technical serves to hide a particular ethno-racial white masculine social ideal. Because obviously the deserving people at the top of the hierarchy all look in a particular way, you know, and they all have a particular sexuality and a particular gender and so forth, and a particular race, of course. So this is what's hidden within when you start to peel away these neoliberal maneuvers, one could say. And in that sense, then blackness, femininity, Islam, and so forth become associated with passion and embodied experience, you know, rather than the reason and the cognition that's associated with this white male heterosexual subject. And that's it's a formidable opponent, because neoliberalism, you think, comes from you know, one of the main gift that Thatcher has bequeathed us. And if you think about, you know, that whole the slogan of 1980s Britain, there is no alternative. You know, neoliberalism has become so normalized as a rationality that people don't think twice about it. I mean, if I see how it's just been uncritically adopted and operationalized in the universities of this country. And I mean, it's a problem in universities across the world, but at least at other universities, people are writing thick books to critique it. You know, here there seems to be an absolutely uncritical acceptance of neoliberal ways of thinking and being and doing. So therefore, let me just move on now. Somebody's keeping time. Okay, great, wonderful. So, just to hop along to the next section. So, in terms of my own research, I found that racist discourses were reactivated by this neoliberal idea of choice, where apartheid gets erased and instead colonial stereotypes are given a new lease on life. Where poverty and deprivation are individualized as a certain person's own failure at self-responsibilization, at being their best self, as the neoliberals would have it, whatever the objective or historical conditions might be. Because a big part of this depoliticization is decontextualization. You actually individualize. If somebody's poor, it's not because they are living in a country that's failing to create jobs and that's got a 37% expanded definition of unemployment. So it's not because of the structural conditions that somebody is poor, it's because there's something inherently the matter with that person. That person is inherently unable to live up to the challenges that this moment poses because of some inherent failure. So that is what neoliberalism normalizes. So the white maneuvers of denial and self-imposed amnesia that are bolstered by neoliberalism draw on primary elements that have historically provided racism with its purchase on subjects. So the idea of race as metaphor for inherent inferiority shares a kinship with the idea of race as phantasmatic. Looking at Achille Mbembe's book that I've mentioned, Critique of Black Reason, he alerts us to take seriously the seemingly irrational dimension of racism, namely the white fantasies about Africa, blackness, and people racialized as black. For centuries, white people have circulated lies, speculation based in fantasy and nonsense as fact. And here we are not talking about far-right obscure tracts. We're talking about that, but we're also talking about writings of respected so-called thinkers in white societies. Particularly if you look at the 18th and 19th century, where, with the development of scientific racism, these were professors at Harvard, etc., most respected thinkers of the time. So, racism is constructed from white insistence on ignorance and the white claim to innocence. And James Baldwin, the African-American thinker, who I think is who's got one of the most astute understandings of the white condition, spoke about, quote, the European vision of the universe is as remarkable for what it pretends to include as for what it remorselessly diminishes, demolishes, or leaves totally out of account. And in turning specifically to white America, he spoke about the genocidal lie of being white, in that European settlers in the USA became white to deny the black presence and justify black subjugation. So becoming white, he says, is imbued with a moral erosion that, as he says, also in that recent documentary that's come out on his life, it's really worth seeing, that led white Americans to invent the Negro problem to safeguard their purity, but it turned them into criminals and monsters. It's turned white people into criminals and monsters because of the role of guilty and constricted white imagination as assigned to the blacks. So Baldwin is for me one of those great thinkers on race and sexuality, and at this point I want to also segue just into critical whiteness studies and briefly look at what this field offers to us. It's a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary field that is one of the most recent theoretical attempts to try and research, analyse and debunk claims of white superiority. So there's quite an influential article that was written about a decade ago by Whiteness Twine and Charles Gallagher, where they identify 3 waves of thinking on whiteness. We can talk about this also in more detail later, but just to say that from the American point of view, the African-American sociologist W.B. Du Bois is a foundational thinker who actually addressed issues such as the unconsciousness of whites, the wages of whiteness, which is where Rudiger gets his title from, and so forth. Then your second way of thinking is associated with people like Toni Morrison, who wrote against this individualization and psychologization of whiteness that we saw in some social science thinking in the States in the 20th century. And the third way of thinking, therefore the second way is really very much about showing it as a structural issue, as opposed to some individualized problem that rests within particular white people. So the third way of thinking is about really looking at whiteness, how it's produced in everyday practices. And that's also what my book, in fact, addresses, this everyday production, how white people produce whiteness, how racism and racism are learned, and how people are socialized into it. Obviously, there are a number of there's potential, but there's also pitfalls in critical whiteness studies. The idea of the 3 waves is quite a US-centric version of the work. One could trace critical white thinking further back, even to someone like Harriet Martineau in the 1830s, who wrote about the heteropatriarchal white supremacism that enabled and upheld slavery in the United States in the 19th century. The work of the African-American activist and journalist R.W. Wells in the early 1890s, which is the most painstaking analysis of lynching and as a gendered and racialized practice, and so forth. So there are a number. Of course, in South Africa, Steve Biko and many other thinkers that we've generated here. So I think it's important to approach critical whiteness studies with quite a wide lens, and also with looking at what's being produced in the global south. Criticisms against critical whiteness studies also pertain to the very notion of homing in on whiteness as a dominant political structure, particularly with regards centering white people's lives, as opposed to how whiteness impacts people of colour. So, as Steve Garner puts it, critical whiteness studies may also give the impression of locating the impetus and possibility of change within white people's minds and actions. Indeed, an obsessive focus on white privilege, the lives and mental worlds of people racialized as white, etc., without sufficient connection to the larger social relations that these form part of, is not a desirable direction of travel, as he puts it. And then also an outcome, probably an unintended outcome, but still a possible outcome of studying whiteness, may be to lend legitimacy to whiteness and to bolster what Garner calls boundary consolidation practices. Bringing it home, in 2010, People may be aware that at nearby Rhodes University, the philosopher Samantha Weiss argued that white people should be engaged in an internal, very personal moral project, quote unquote, about how to deal with their past and ongoing privilege. White people should withdraw from the political sphere and adopt a stance of humility and silence. And she argued that this would allow for the listening to the voices of others instead of seeking to be heard. Furthermore, white people should embark upon a personal and introspective journey with the repair of their damaged moral core as a final goal. Eusebius McKaiser then decided to pluck Samantha Weiss from academic obscurity and wrote about it in various media and brought her thinking to a large audience and actually created quite a productive debate in the process. And she then adapted her position to say that she feels that white self-reflection is necessary so that we, as white people, can realize that we are not as we should be, and that it's a cause for shame and a quieter political presence. But she then said at that point she's not calling for apathy or withdrawal from all public life. Rather, she's saying whites ought to work together with black people to make the country better, but we should do it quietly and in the background, working on the selves that are cause for shame before we judge others. And so on. So she adapted her position, not just to say it's not a complete withdrawal, basically, as she suggested. So just to look at these possible shortcomings of critical whiteness studies, it's very clear that in order to avoid critical whiteness studies becoming an exercise in white indulgence, it has to be relational. So the impact of racism, of whiteness on black people needs to be brought to the fore in the work that's being done. And it must always be a critique that's aimed at understanding and dismantling unequal power relations. I mean, I went to a whiteness conference in Germany once where there was a presentation on country music that turned out to be such a piece of white nostalgia that, you know, they just enjoyed listening to the songs and showing the videos, and there was absolutely no critique of even though it followed actually on a study that was quite critical of country music as a form of white nostalgia. But then the actual presentation that this particular person did was a form of white nostalgia in itself. So that means one has to center the critique, basically, of power. It needs to be a centering of power and how to dismantle these unequal power relations that are propped up by whiteness. The political intent of critical whiteness work must be clear as being part of the larger anti-racist project to avoid it to serve as a mere cover to reify whiteness. It must be linked into other struggles for social justice, also intersectionally, in relation to gender, sexuality, class, and so forth. Those are, I think, important criteria from my point of view in terms of ensuring that one doesn't just collapse into some kind of, what's that expression about gazing at your belly. So it follows, therefore, that the activist dimension of critical whiteness studies is essential. However, white people engaged in anti-racist thinking and more broadly in social justice activism have become a specific target of globally rising racial populisms of all hues. It has become a feature of our increasingly acrimonious public discourse in South Africa, both popularly and academically. A feature of this discourse is that it is deeply influenced by social media talk that originates in the global north, as I pointed out for you already with the local versions of the alt-right, the local neoliberals. So we also find on the leftist side terms being adopted such as woke, and then a term that I'll spend a bit more time on, or a phrase that I'll spend more time on, virtue signaling. So the white people who express an anti-racist position and or do anti-racist work or do social justice work are attacked by the new right and the alt-right as race traitors, and more recently as SJWs, which stands for social justice warriors, and it's meant in a pejorative sense that. Another term that I've already highlighted is the so-called libtard. Political correctness, PC, is another term that's still rolled out. after many decades, and this one is a favorite go-to. And it indicates a slavish disposition in relation to ideology. Tony Leon, for example, in a column earlier this year wrote about, and I mean he himself is an example of the neoliberal turn of South African liberal thinking. He wrote a column in which he attacked academics for virtue signaling and political correctness when they committed themselves to refusing invitations from universities in Israel. So, looking a bit more at virtue signaling, because I find it, of these phrases, it's one of those that actually brings populists on both sides together. It serves as an appropriate example of the politics playing out presently. Just in terms of the short history of the phrase, it was popularised by a writer at The Spectator, a British magazine, in 2015, but it was previously used in religious studies to actually address actual the signalling of religious virtue, basically. It is a derogatory term that refers to people who, for the sake of self-aggrandizement, conspicuously support political and other causes to exhibit their virtuousness, particularly using the shorthand messages associated with social media, but without actively doing anything to advance said causes. It is relevant, I think, that the person who popularised this term at The Spectator himself is attached to a neoliberal think tank, and he has written out and opposed social welfare support, such as the National Health Service and the minimum wage policy in Britain. So, no surprises thus far. The New Statesman said that the term is actually used to stigmatise empathy. The Guardian said that it started out as a clever way to win arguments, but it's become a lazy put-down. It's too often used to cast aspersions on opponents as an alternative to rebutting their arguments. And then Medium.com, Alexandra Erin, writing there, she was talking about how the phrase virtue signalling serves to aid and abet in the current political climate globally. It's as a term that is used to silence people with whom you disagree, used by those who want their political opinions to be represented exclusively and accepted as default, to the point that nobody is even allowed to acknowledge that those are political or opinions. So it is therefore surprising if one thinks of this phrase, how it's being used, and so forth, that and you know, the fact that it's loved by neoliberals and alt-rightists alike, it's that it is also being used within the anti-racist sphere to attack white people who are critical of contemporary and historical racism. I'm giving it as an example of a discourse, and I'm trying just to use this one particular phrase to show a broader discourse, of which there are many other examples. So, anecdotally, in a conversation that I had with a student who identified as a Pan-Africanist at the University of Pretoria, he basically insisted that white people should withdraw from public spaces of engagement, so plus minus the Samantha Bos argument. But he particularly targeted white people who are who declare themselves to be anti-racist and who do anti-racist work. So they should be withdrawing from public spaces. And then he said that racist whites are actually beyond the pale, and therefore they're not worth attacking. So this is actually a conversation we had a bit. We had some of this conversation. Well, we were talking about this yesterday. Quite coincidentally, I've already written a paper, so I'm looking forward to a lively debate afterwards. Yes. But this idea of so racist whites don't have to be attacked because they're just beyond the pale. But the same does not go for anti-racist whites. So, in an argument that I found in a book that came out recently, the position is that open racists are actually preferable because they wear their ignorance with conviction. For a white person to speak of white people as not homogenous is read as a statement of power and of not owning up to the structural power of whiteness in which all white people share. White people who speak out against racism are experienced as silencing of black people. Indeed, white anti-racists are only seeking to elevate themselves, this is not virtue signaling, to elevate themselves above open racists. They want to stand out from other white people. So it's like a kind of an ego ego trip, basically. Hence, virtue signaling. So, indeed, this makes alliance, affection, and trust impossible. And such white people, that the person writes in this book, should undertake their journey, of which the nature is unspecified, on their own. There's some kind of journey that white people should undertake, but preferably, or not preferably, definitely on their own. And in similar discourses, it's been said that even friendship among black and white people is an impossibility. It cannot exist. So, from where I'm sitting, it seems to me that at the base of this thinking, whether from right or left-wing populism, lies a common dedication to race essentialism. Essentialism refers to the conviction that we have unchangeable cause of identity at the center of our being, whether of a gender, sexual, racial, or another variety. When it comes to race, there are particular attributes of whiteness and blackness which form inescapable essences that we are beholden to. That's what essentialism basically posits as an ideology. This thinking says that we've got these inextricable racial attributes that are inherent to us, and they then form the basis of either racial superiority or inferiority. Racial superiority hinges, among other things, on the phantasm of racial purity, of a pure racial origin and character that is completely opposite to those racialized others, those that are racially other to you. Of course, this is a nonsense, you know, there is no such thing as a pure identity, there's no such, it's absolutely non-existent. Given the fact that these are all social constructions made up, and of course the actual existing hybridity of who we are, you know, if you actually look at where we come from. But this ideology of race essentialism insists on absolute otherness between white and black. For white supremacists, such as the apartheid ideologues and the white right today and so forth, this absolute otherness means that racial interaction can only ever degenerate into hostilities to the point of a so-called race war. And you still hear that term being used by the white right. So that's why we needed apartheid. That was the argument for apartheid. If we have contact with one another, there's going to be a race war, basically. For white and black essentialists both, the human interaction inherent to the formation of human society is anathema. They both dream of a pure, otherless universe, such as they believe existed in the midst of time. Sociality is therefore necessarily impossible. Therefore, mutual human recognition as a political project must necessarily be avoided. For me, this is the politics of narcissism and nihilism, which is the opposite of the vision that's proffered in our constitution. And I should add at this point, of course, a lot of works also don't discredit the vision of the constitution, which also involves a cynical attack on democracy as an institution. So the question is then, to end off with, are solidarities possible across these frontiers that continued racialization has newly erected? And if at all possible, what would such a politics look like? And I'm obviously not going to say anything conclusive, and I'm looking forward to a conversation on whether this is possible. But from where I'm standing, Mbembe definitely offers some pathways out in his latest book. His translator, Laurent Dubois, my French is non-existent, says that the book is a call to new futures. Instead of vengeance, or a simple mimetic inversion of what was previously showered with malediction, as Mbembe writes so poetically, we are implored to struggle for a world beyond race. I want to agree with black South African thinkers Edgar Pieterse and Frank Meintjes about the need for a pursuit of politics of possibility, or what the African American theorist Cornel West calls a new politics of cultural difference. It's an old article, but still very relevant, I think, in this moment. And he was describing the time when he was writing it in the early 90s as a time of polarization, but of course, look where we are now. So Cornel West talks about, he says, in the face of ever greater polarization, we have reached a new stage in the perennial struggle for freedom and dignity. That requires the forging of reliable alliances between people of color and white progressives, guided by a moral and political vision of greater democracy and individual freedom, to dare to recast, redefine and revise the very notions of modernity, mainstream, margins, otherness. This politics requires critical sensibilities and personal accountability by people of colour, he says, but I would obviously add, drawing on a disposition of critical whiteness, that this especially requires accountability from white people. We have to own up as white people to the burdens of the past. We must engage in an ethical interrogation of racism that includes engaging on the need of reparation and restitution. And this links to what Pumla Gobordema-Madikizela has written. I'm sure Marisa knows her work well, given that she field is trauma and reconciliation. And she writes about the inability to face the moral issues of the past plays itself out in repetition in contemporary South Africa. And this is really true if you look at our 20th century history. She suggested we use memory in creative ways to rebuild human relations. Mampela Rampele has got the idea of an emotional settlement, which to deal with the past, and using as our point of departure the promise that we made one another in the preamble to the Constitution. Mbembe furnishes us with ideas that could revitalise the difficult dialogues that are happening here and there, also this afternoon, but still not on a scale that could shift relations. So Andre Kleep was talking yesterday about the need to upscale. We need to be upscaling these interactions into political projects, in fact. Mbembe proposes that it starts with the reaffirmation of the innate dignity of every human being and with the idea of human community, what he calls the in common. He speaks of the interplay between difference and similarity. He says the other is not only different, but also similar. Claiming difference is not to deny the in common. So the politics of difference is not actually to deny the in common. In fact, he points out that the desire for difference actually springs from the desire for inclusion and recognition. The politics of difference, where you're claiming your humanity in relation to your difference, is actually because you are being excluded and you're trying to overturn that exclusion. You're actually trying to achieve inclusion and recognition. So he says that this could form the basis of very necessary social conversations. And I would add to this just the whole point of if we look at what I've been saying earlier on about neoliberalism, how it plays out, alt-rightism, how it plays out. Clearly, this idea of logical arguments, if we're going to be using logical arguments to convince people to not be racist, that's not getting the necessary purchase. We're not actually, that kind of, the logical argument is not gaining the necessary traction. So, and this is perhaps where Rampele is right about an emotional settlement. We were actually bringing in affect. We were talking yesterday about the function of shame. Andre also mentioned guilt and so forth, but you could probably think of a few positive emotions as well. Concerted mass effort of allies is required, I believe, who come together on the basis of a shared dedication to democracy and anti-racism, and also against other intersecting structural injustices on the basis of gender, sexuality, and class. We have been trained, basically, in all of these abominations, and the question is, how do we untrain ourselves? Thanks.
Thank you. We've got quite there's only a small overlap really between the audience in terms of people from yesterday and today, a couple of people from yesterday, but a few new faces in the house as well. And we hope that you're going to utilize the opportunity to engage with Christi. She doesn't, as she said, she doesn't have all the answers, but hopefully we can have a conversation together around it, because we are in the same space as academics, as staff, as students, etc. So with that, I'm going to open up the floor. You are welcome to make comments. You can pose questions, and everybody must feel free to participate. Maybe you can say who you are and if you're from a faculty or if you're a student or something.
Hello, I'm Billy from Faculty of Education. Percy, you started off by saying something about the waves that racism followed. The biological wave, which was followed in by the socio-cultural wave, in which it was not defined in biological terms anymore. But I read something the other day, David Gilbourne, who analyzed the works of some advisors to the British government, Robert Plomer, who uses the advances in gene studies, genetic studies, to start advancing sort of a hidden racism. So it seems to me as if racism is making a biological turn again. Now, if we accept that, would there be any worth in examining how at least the biological turn in racism was sort of got into a quiet space? And that is now for strategies to advance a critical right project. Even if racism rears its socio-cultural head again, do you think there would be something in the history of racism for us to learn from during this time now that biological science has become ever more sophisticated? And we know that some nice studies being done attributing certain heart conditions to black men, certain kinds of headaches to Sutu women, and so on.
Anyone else want to bring something in? Thanks. Thanks. We take one or two more.
Thank you. Zone to studying politics anyway. I sort of agree with there's something you said about whether white people should not be in politics or in the public sphere or to take a back seat and whatever. I think maybe the problem that I've seen in my life is that a lot of times race, like the issue of race has in the past and till now been the burden of black people. So maybe, I wouldn't say white people should take a back burner or whatever, but maybe to sort of build, how could I put this? Maybe more discussions amongst themselves, maybe, because of that. Because I read an opinion piece written by William, the grandson of Wood, where he said that he was arguing that the racism continues because in our family braais, when someone says the K word, we laugh and we don't like, it's not cool anymore towards stuff like that, And I was watching a movie, it's called Sorry to Bother You, where the main character climbs up the corporate ladder purely by channeling his white voice, but he's a black guy channeling his white voice. So I wanna, so I wanna ask in that sense that with this whole discussion, has whiteness, is it like a thing in itself where even certain white people are not white enough? Because when you look at in the States, Italians and Irish, they weren't really classified as whites, right? Like I think right up until the 1940s or 50s, something like that. And also lastly, with regards to the rise of the alt-rights in the European parliamentary elections, Donald Trump, Brexit, etc., how much of an impact, I mean, the crisis of global capitalism, right? How much of an impact do you think it has on these movements or people coming up right now? And, yeah, stuff like that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. One more.
Good afternoon. Audible. I think Udi has kind of largely captured, my question in one of the parts of his multi-part question, I think. I think we touched on this after the book launch last night, around the issue of Ukutshintshwa mentioned that it's been a burden of the black people to kind of like educate and all of that about whiteness. I'm trying to bring it to ground level in like our normal everyday interactions, where I would like to have a conversation with Mariska as a white person, where we are quite critical of the concept of whiteness. Attempts towards that at times have been met with defense, white tears. I think yesterday the concept of shame and all of that, kind of came up. How do we break that down? Be able to have a conversation, about where, in my problematizing your whiteness, I'm sorry to use you an example person, but in my problematizing your whiteness, how do we go beyond those walls of defense, of guilt, of shame? And because you'll find that you try to have those, and it's not necessarily me attacking Marissa, the white person, but Marissa's whiteness. And I think like what Brian said over there can be something that even I perhaps use to progress. So how do we take the conversation further in a way that we can engage further than just the guilt, whereas it's like, no, I'm not racist, I never liked apartheid, I've always been liberal and all of that, but how do we then bring up that, I think the English word is complicity, and all of that, and the fact that, quite frankly, you are a beneficiary of white privilege. Because I think personal experiences with people I interact with, when you raise these kinds of things, it's like, we're so tired of these dictionary terms. All these terms that have just become fashionable. So, at what point do we then, go beyond that and actually have a meaningful and critical conversation that I think is what we all need as a nation to be able to then, progress in this race thing. Right.
Thank you. I think we will one, two. Yeah, well, there's a mouthful.
Okay, thank you. Yes, really, actually when I wrote this paper, I was actually thinking that I should add about the return to biological racism, and then I completely forgot, so thanks for refreshing my memory on that. But yes, the thing is, even at the university where I'm based at the moment, I was recently quite surprised to find on the landing page they like to do PR for research that's done at the university, and there was something, black men are more likely to get some kind of something or other illness. And I was also sort of wondering, so what exactly is it because in terms of medical treatment but if you can identify the group in advance, can you do some prevention, or what is the actual use of the racial identification around, and it's unclear to me, and I think it is racism that's been brought in through the back door. I've actually had long arguments, because it's similar to the argument around sexuality, whether sexuality is genetically based or not. And the minute you finally pin down that it is genetically based, then why don't you just go and go into adjust fetuses before they're born, and just get rid of that sexual, that gay, so-called gay gene, So there's a major moral issue here, and there's ethical issues, and there's also the way is really open for major abuses. In terms of how scientific racism was sort of stopped in its tracks previously, so eugenics as a form of thinking was actually what gave us in the end Nazism, in the form that it took, and what ultimately stopped, that version of racism that's medically, biologically based, was the atrocities of the Second World War. So I don't know if that is basically, because I do, for me there are many elements at the moment, many features that remind strongly of the world in the run-up to the Second World War, actually. And if you look at the kinds of these populisms that we're talking about, the racial populisms, they've got a definite fascist overtone. So fascism as a form of politics, left and right, seems to be also rearing its head again. So combined then with biological racism, I think we're in a very, very dangerous era, and I can't actually see. I think at the moment that the divisions are such that no concerted counter project is being launched, and that's actually what's a major concern. Against these fascist mobilizations and so forth. Exactly what needs to be done to do that is complete. That's another whole debate. In terms of yes, of course, it is absolutely true, Zonda, that burden of race has been carried by black people. So in a sense, I think from a critical whiteness point of view, this is a burden that should be carried by white people, shouldn't be carried by black people. And I think that in terms of critical whiteness work, in fact, Dimitri Erasmus, who's just written a fantastic book called Race Otherwise, that people can really get. She talks about the necessity for white people to do the white work. And what that actually means that white people have to confront and engage one another in terms of the dismantling of racism, in relation to one another. So a lot of my work has to do with that. I do a lot of public engagement to do exactly that. And there are a number of other people, but Alan Verwoerd actually is also an example of somebody who's doing that. But the thing is for me, for white people to not, because I'm seeing a bit of a tension between what Zondile and Zondu are saying, because in a sense, almost sounds like white people should not be actually engaging on race, because they don't really know. They're not in a position, they don't have racial knowledge in a sense, because they haven't been on the receiving end of race as a mode of oppression and discrimination and exclusion and so forth. Because I think it is very important to be engaging and to have what Alan calls these difficult dialogues exactly on this. But white people will need to also be part of that conversation, because it's how do you shift people if they're not in the conversation, or if they. But saying, I mean, that doesn't mean, of course, white people get all the time to talk. That's not, and that's why people. I mean, I actually went to a diversity session at the university where I'm based now. It's like diversity sessions for all of the staff. And these diversity sessions actually frequently turned out to be almost like support groups for white men. Because the white men were so upset about, the incredible dangers that they face, and, it's very hard at the top and all of that. And they were, so people would actually commiserate with them. Even the facilitators would be, oh, shame, and taking extra care to include the white guy, you know. And I mean, in the session where I was, there was one white man, and they were faffing about him so much. I mean, it was incredible. It was like buffing his ego, and shame must fix to come. So really, I mean, it's so that's also it's a major problem, you know. Where there's this like bending backward to try and that's where I mean, white people have to be much more resilient in terms of hearing those difficult things that black people have to say to them, you know. And I think that it is part of white defensiveness to just say no, I don't want to hear. I'd rather walk away. But what is interesting to me is with this doing difference differently, and that's my last word on this, doing difference differently module that I designed for the University of Pretoria. Our big problem was always, the big problem with critical diversity work or with anti-racist work is how do you get white people in the room? Because they're so defensive they don't want to be there. Because they don't want to hear the truth, basically. I think that whiteness, the central plan of whiteness is plain lies. Okay, you know. So and what I found with doing difference differently, the first 3 years were about voluntary enrollment. So students, first-year students, had to actually enroll themselves. And the only way that we did, we would just try and popularize it and try and get the message to them, but we couldn't force students to participate in some. And what was interesting, by the third year, we actually had a majority of white students enrolling in the course. And there, the delivery there was mainly online, and then with one exercise, it's an interaction with somebody else. And in a sense, it was sort of outside of this kind of setup. And I was wondering, you know, because of white shame, that you, maybe if you are sitting in a different space and you're being exposed to the material, you know, online, and then when you're engaging, it's with a complete stranger. So, you know, you could test and you can actually be challenged in your ideas with that person. Sometimes there's a confidence in you know, the comfort of strangers, you know, somebody that you don't know. Because I was actually, and there were majority white men also, which is interesting. So in the previous years we always had majority of women. It's also more difficult to get, white people in and more difficult to get particularly white men in. And we actually managed to. So I'm thinking we must be exploring different ways of actually getting these conversations and these confrontations going. Because white people have to be confronted and white people have to face up. You know, as Baldwin also says, you know, the monstrousness of what their privilege is built on. You know.
Well, thank you. So there's something to chew on. I know that it's getting late. It's 4 o'clock, but I think we can at least do another round and give us some food for thought as to what is possible. I like what Zandi said about we're trying to also think about our own environment that we're in and what can we do here, because of course if you're speaking to people in other spaces, if you're speaking to people in a primary school or high school or something, to be another context, and they know what works there, or in sport or something, But we are here, and some of us will be here for 3 years or 4 years or whatever. And what does that actually mean? So I'll pass over. There's a mic somewhere. I see 1, 2, 3. Yeah, over there. 1, 2, 3.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Molefi. I'm from the Faculty of Law at Nelson Mandela. So first I'd like to, I'll try and be as brief as possible. I remember back in 2009, the current, actually it's the former, at the time I think he was a Minister of Communications, his name is Superiority. He said something about the need for colored people to move from the Western Cape and integrate with the rest of the country. And
that was money.
Or was it money?
Money.
Okay, yeah, and he got into trouble for saying that. But anyway, fast forward to 2018, I moved from Pretoria. Originally I'm from Botswana, but I moved from Pretoria, I moved to Port Elizabeth. And I see in Port Elizabeth, my opinion is that there are actually three worlds in one. You have the black people living in the townships, the white people living in the suburbs and in most of town, and the tourists living along the beaches and lodges and B&Bs of Somerset along the beach. So my question is, how far do you think the country as a whole needs to go for us to integrate with one another, whereby you perhaps can get the municipality or government to put in place initiatives whereby it can say, okay, we're going to organize bus tours, white people can maybe go to Motherwell and see how people live there, how black people live there, and vice versa, you know, because I don't think I've ever come across a black person from Motherwell or New Brighton who says, I have a white friend living in Somerset. There's actually most of them are probably students. So I don't know, I think in as much as we like to speak about political willingness to do something, I think there's also a lack of personal willingness to engage with one another, which I suppose is based on mistrust built upon what has happened in the past. I think mainly black people need to heal from what has happened in the past, but my opinion is for as long as black people need to heal, it may take a bit of a long time, but my question to you is, how far do you think we still need to go?
Okay. Thank you.
My question actually is, I heard your input actually, maybe start on a lighter note when you spoke about how these diversity sessions turn into support groups for white guys, and reminded me of someone that said, no, forget about the white rhino, what about the white dog? He needs to be still safe. But in any case, my question, I think in your talk you actually went at length actually to try and outline what the obstacles are and why racism is so pervasive actually. And your topic is actually whether critical white project is possible. So towards the back end of your talk you did give us some small pointers from theoretical insights that one could use in moving the project to a new way of thinking, always new frameworks of thinking. But I think talks in the awareness and even Sachi chairs, they do this kind of work, people like Melissa, Emmett Butts and all that, that is, in my view, I think it is probably one way of doing awareness work, but for me somehow I think it needs to go beyond that sort of thing. So my question actually would be to ask you maybe what are the mechanisms that you see actually that can bring this critical white project to fruition? What are those mechanisms? The way I see it actually, I think actually we need to bridge also this gap. As you say, we don't have all the answers. I'm sure no one of us have those answers. But we need somehow to bridge the gap between the sort of awareness work that happens in university lectures like this with practical realities, maybe things like social movements and that sort of thing that I would stop in.
Hello, I'm Inge from Visual Arts. So I have two things. The one is probably more of just a conundrum in my head, and that is that space of whiteness and white people. You know, sometimes it's like, oh, whiteness and white people, those are two different things. But at the same time, and it sometimes feels like a get out of jail card free. And I'm talking about whiteness, I'm not talking about white people. But at the same time, it's so intertwined and it's so connected, and it's that accountability of actually, if you're talking about whiteness, you are talking about white people. You know, you are talking about me. You know, and the need to be able to own that and actually be there as a lived experience is important to have. And the relationship I haven't made sense of. You know, Then the other thing is that I wonder sometimes how much of our societal sort of way of being, if I think about how we work so hard at hiding vulnerability, hiding any sense of weakness, hiding shame, you know, how social media becomes this fantasy space of look how cool we are, look how amazing we are, look how strong we are, look how powerful we are, you know, life is just so perfect. You know, how much of that way of being is actually also part of the space where we're not willing to be authentic, not willing to own some of the realities of our weaknesses and our failures and our transgressions, and to be willing to actually go there and own the shame and be authentic with each other.
Thank you. Are we okay with those three?
Look, as I said, I don't have the answers, so I think these are very good questions, and I think, you know, it shows that you know, one can have yeah, I mean, I know that you've embarked CriSHET at least, and I'm sure with candidates work, of course. You have been engaging in this in an ongoing way, and that's what needs to be happening. I just saw that in terms of the bridging between the gaps, the gap between what's happening in academia and what's happening in, for example, civil society more broadly. I think that's a very necessary thing. I'm sometimes astounded at how disconnected academic work is from the broader society. You know, my own work, I engage a lot in the media, and I try to get my work out as much as possible, and so forth. But a lot of academics don't see it as important. And sometimes amazing work is done, and absolutely nobody knows about it. You know, so using our intellectual work, the time that we're spending intellectually to think through problems, to use that also to better the place where we are. You know, for me, that you can't disconnect yourself. This idea, and of course, academics realised this during the course of apartheid, and that's why by the 1980s you had a significant group of academics who also spoke out actively against apartheid, and you needed that change across all sectors for apartheid ultimately to be brought down, or at least the official version of it. So it is very, very important to make those connections, and we're not making them. I mean, I think that's. I don't have a perfect set of mechanisms, however. You know, I do, in terms of my own work, I try to engage as much as possible. I try to popularise the work that's being done by other people as well, and try to get that out, and so on. And I'm trying to create spaces for that to happen, and that's what I'm doing in Canada. So, of course, Canada is an example of exactly. You know, an organisation that's doing that work, you know, situated within the university context, but actually able to draw on those knowledges and taking them out. And so that is very important. I don't have anything other than that to say at this point. Maybe a more systematic process of thinking through what could such mechanisms be is actually necessary. Maybe that's something that we could also take up. In terms of Molefi, what you were saying about these apartheid geographies and how they're still determining our lives. Joburg, of course, when you look at in terms of interactions, class-based interactions, you're seeing sort of the derationalization of middle-class spaces and definitely of elite spaces. So you're seeing much more interaction among black and white people in middle-class and elite spaces, in Joburg, and I would imagine, Pretoria also sort of some spots probably here as well, and so forth. But it's still very much limited to a minority of people, and that is a huge challenge. I mean, part of it has to do with the fact that our city planning is still perpetuating these geographies. Because you need to you have to physically bridge those gaps. You have to physically actually bring communities together. And that's, I think our whole activism should be should be launched around that. You know, why are we seeing? I'm sometimes amazed if you're traveling in the rural areas. You like say in the Free State or so, it's quite flattish. You approach a town, you can literally see that's the white town, that's the black township, and the RDP houses are on the other side. They're not being built in between. They're being built on the other side, away from the white town. So how on earth is that happening? You know, I mean, and the thing is, I don't look really at urban planning or these kinds of you know, city development issues and so forth. But it would seem to me as though this is shouting out for a politics, you know, to confront this. You know, whiteness and white people. You know, it makes me think of Jeff Hearn. Of course. You know, it's interesting when the minute you start to think of masculinity in the same way, sexuality in the same way, in terms of how to confront whiteness, the way that you're confronting masculinity, the way you're confronting. So, and Jeff Hearn, who's done some great work in masculinities, but he says, don't call it masculinities, talk about men, you know, to actually bring it home to the actual, those embodied beings, you know, who are in some way receiving a benefit, not all an equal benefit from masculinity or from patriarchy, but you do benefit if you're a man, you know. And of course, the minute you bring in the intersecting differences, you might be benefiting more or less, but still, you know. So I think it is important to actually say white people, to speak about white people. You know, I think that is important. I think whiteness just allows us as a concept to also think of it as a structural phenomenon, you know, something that actually organises social relations more broadly. In terms of vulnerability, wanting to be authentic and not showing our weaknesses, and of course social media, the thing is, in this neoliberal moment, you know, this is hyper-individualisation also, and of course, as a post-structuralist, I don't believe in an authentic self. I don't believe there's nothing authentic about us. We basically learn and we construct our identities all the time, and we make up these authentic selves, and then we project them also via social media. You know. So the question for me would be, how can we actually get ourselves and others to stop projecting a racist? You know, why are you constructing an identity? Why is racism one of your resources as a white person to construct your identity? Why can't it be anti-racist? You know? So it's a shame. Yeah, well. So, but shame is a very, I mean, it's also about actually confronting yourself. Doing that self-reflection becomes extremely important. So in this thing of the hyper-individualisation, where you're on a platform, you're putting yourself on a little bit of stage all the time, all these performances and so forth, you know, where does self-reflection actually fit in there? Because it is about this presentation as opposed to, okay, what am I actually busy with in this presentation? Reflecting on your presentation, you know. Anyway, we can leave it at that. Thank you so much. I do appreciate you all staying, and it's on Friday afternoon, it's fantastic. And let's continue with this conversation.
Thank you, Christi. I'm going to give a hand to Christi coming all the way from Joburg, and we hope that we're going to benefit greatly from your coming into the space in the new year, and so you can let the word out that you know, in the faculties, etc. I think we're going to need, this is only the start of a conversation, you know, that we're going to need to have going forward. I think there's some very serious questions being posed around, you know, the structural racism, the inequality in society, the social movements that are out there. I'm hoping that as active, you know, participants, as citizens, that we really work to bridge the gap. There are people who still see us as an ivory tower, you know, and also be on this side of town, you know, far away from Motherwell and Brighton and Mazakere and Galvandale and from Bevingsdorp, etc. And what do we do and how do we do to try to bridge the gap? So on Wednesday, I'm talking about the intersectional struggles. How does my gender define my life? Okay? How does it define my life? That's the topic at the community dialogue on the Missionville campus. And we have two leaders from the national shutdown kind of movement there. And we have, in colloquial terms, this NGO are recovering patriarchs, they call themselves. They're going to be there as well. So for the men who need to work on themselves, come into the space and come and hear what these colleagues from UTNA and from PE say. I think also it's important to say thank you to CriSHET. They need you and your team putting things together. You're organizing a great space. We like it on a Friday afternoon because of course after this we're not going to go back to work. So please keep it up, etc. And yeah, we're going to be. I don't know if we have anything more. Maybe from your side, is there another? Are we coming to closure? Or, as a whatever, and then we're kicking off again in the new year. But really, to Nobele, to the team, thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure coming here. There's some part, of course, I see. I'm not sure there's still something to kind of take home there, but please do that. Thank you very much, everybody.